Keanu Reeves had always been the kind of person people underestimated. Not because he was weak, not because he was slow, but because he never felt the need to announce himself. In a world full of loud voices and big claims, Keanu moved quietly. He trained without cameras. He worked without applause. He smiled at strangers on the street, held doors open, sat with homeless people, and never once asked for credit. That's the kind of man he was. So when word started spreading that Keanu Reeves had stepped into something involving Steven Seagal, people didn't just raise an eyebrow. They stopped completely. Wait, Keanu? That Keanu? The internet lit up instantly. Comments flooded in. Clips were shared. Threads exploded. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone had the same starting point. Keanu wasn't ready for this. But here's the thing about quiet people. They rarely tell you what they know. And what Keanu knew, what he had been quietly building for years, was about to completely rewrite the story everyone thought they understood. Steven Seagal needed no introduction. The man had built an entire identity around being unshakable. Big presence, bigger confidence, and a reputation that walked into the room before he did. Steven didn't just believe in himself. He radiated that belief in a way that made others question themselves before anything even started. His career, his image, everything he had built said the same thing. Don't test me. And for a long time, nobody did. So when Keanu's name got attached to this situation, most people assumed it would end quickly. Not because Keanu wasn't talented. Anyone who had watched him work knew better than that. But because Keanu had never seemed interested in this kind of thing. He avoided conflict. He chose peace. He trained in silence. Which is exactly what made this so confusing. Because Keanu wasn't running from it this time. He wasn't explaining. He wasn't denying. He wasn't posting anything online or calling anyone to set the record straight. He was just quiet. And that silence started to feel like something else entirely. Before we go any further, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your country and city in the comments. Let's see how far this story is traveling. Now here's what most people missed in the early days of this situation. They were so focused on comparing the two men that they forgot to ask a more important question. Why would Keanu, of all people, not walk away? This wasn't a man chasing fame or trying to prove something to the world. Keanu had nothing to gain from a confrontation. He had already built a career, a legacy, a reputation that most people spend their whole lives chasing. He wasn't hungry for attention. He had never been. So if he wasn't stepping back, something real had pushed him forward. That detail alone should have changed how people were reading the situation. But most people were too busy picking sides. Steven's camp felt confident. They pointed to experience, to presence, to a long history of being exactly the kind of person you don't want standing across from you. Keanu's fans were quieter, but they were pointing at something different. They were pointing at patterns. Do you think the most dangerous person in any situation is the loudest one in the room or the calmest one? Drop your answer in the comments. Loud or calm? Here's what the patterns showed. When you went back and looked at Keanu's history, not the movie posters, not the action sequences, but the real history, what you found was something that most people had completely overlooked. Consistency. Not a highlight reel. Not a single impressive moment. Consistent, quiet, relentless preparation. Year after year. Before anyone was watching. Before it mattered to anyone but him. People who had trained alongside Keanu over the years started talking. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just honestly. He never showed off. He never talked about what he was working on. He just worked. Every day. With the same level of focus whether the camera was rolling or not. That's a different kind of discipline. Most people train hard when someone is watching. Keanu trained the same whether no one was watching at all. Meanwhile, Steven was in full confidence mode. And why wouldn't he be? His name alone carried weight. His history spoke for itself. The idea that this quiet, humble, motorcycle riding actor could represent any kind of real challenge seemed almost amusing to him. He made comments. Small ones. Light ones. The kind that carried just enough edge to let everyone know he wasn't worried. And the crowd responded. A lot of people agreed with him. But a smaller group, the ones paying close attention, noticed something. Stephen was talking. Keanu was still silent. And in situations like this, silence is never nothing. Silence is a choice. And choices tell you more about a person than words ever can. Have you ever been in a situation where you stayed quiet not because you had nothing to say, but because you didn't need to say it? Comment yes or no. As days passed, the noise around this story grew louder. More opinions, more hot takes, more people drawing lines in the sand. And through all of it, Keanu remained the same. No press, no statements, no interviews, nothing. Stephen seemed to take that as confirmation. He's not responding because there's nothing to respond with. That assumption was the first mistake. Because what Keanu was doing wasn't hiding. He wasn't avoiding. He was something far more focused than that. He was ready. Not ready in the way you get ready when pressure shows up suddenly. Ready in the way you become when you've spent years preparing for a moment you always knew might come. The kind of ready that doesn't need to announce itself because it has nothing left to prove. Stephen had spent his career preparing for confrontation by making sure people never wanted to confront him. Keanu had spent his career preparing differently. He prepared so that when something came, he didn't have to think. He could just respond. Two very different strategies. And they were about to meet. Which type of preparation do you trust more? The kind that tries to prevent the moment from happening, or the kind that prepares you for when it does? Comment prevent or prepare. Here's something interesting about human psychology. When someone very confident meets someone very calm, the confident person usually feels uneasy. Not immediately, not obviously, but underneath, something shifts. Confidence needs feedback. It needs reactions. It needs the other person to respond, to flinch, to push back, to do something that confirms the power dynamic. Calm doesn't give you any of that. Calm just watches. Calm waits. Calm processes. And from the outside, that can look like weakness. But from the inside of the situation, it feels completely different. Stephen was starting to feel it now. Not fear. Not doubt. Something harder to name. A kind of pressure that doesn't push you. It just sits there. And the more you try to ignore it, the heavier it gets. He doubled down on confidence. Spoke more. Projected more. Let his reputation do more of the talking. Keanu stayed exactly the same. No reaction. No shift. No emotion. And that drove the conversation in a completely new direction. Because the audience was no longer talking about who would win a physical confrontation. They were asking something else entirely. What does Keanu know that Stephen doesn't? That question, once people started asking it, changed everything. Because it meant the audience had already made a decision. Not about ability. About awareness. They believed, without any evidence, that Keanu was seeing something Stephen was missing. And you know what? They weren't wrong. Do you think overconfidence is more dangerous than weakness? Comment over or weak. Let's talk about what was actually happening beneath the surface, because this story had layers that most people never bothered to find. Keanu Reeves has always had a complicated relationship with pain. Not in the dramatic way people sometimes say that. In a very real, very documented way. He lost his best friend. He lost a child. He watched people he loved disappear. And through all of it, he kept showing up. Quietly. Without performance. Without asking for sympathy. That kind of loss either breaks people, or it builds something inside them that cannot easily be shaken. Keanu had been shaken. Many times. And each time, he came back steadier than before. That's not something you can fake. That's not something you build in a gym or earn through a reputation. That is forged in a completely different kind of fire. Stephen's confidence came from success. From wins. From a long history of people stepping back. Keanu's stillness came from survival. From years of facing things far bigger than any confrontation and choosing to remain whole anyway. The difference between confidence built on winning and strength built on surviving is enormous. And most people never consider it until it's standing right in front of them. Stephen hadn't considered it yet. Have you ever met someone who had been through something really difficult and came out the other side somehow calmer than everyone around them? Comment yes or no. Now the moment was getting closer. Everyone could feel it. The story had been building for days, and now the air had changed. It was the kind of tension that doesn't crackle. It settles, heavy and still, like the sky before a big storm that never quite breaks the way you expect. Keanu walked into the space without drama. No entrance, no statement, no performance. Just a man arriving the same way he arrived anywhere. Present, unbothered. Stephen registered this immediately. He had been in enough rooms with enough people to read energy quickly. And the energy coming off Keanu wasn't what he had prepared for. There was no nervousness, no attempt to establish anything, no posturing, just stillness. And stillness, when you're used to people responding to your presence with tension, is deeply disorienting. Stephen kept his posture strong, his expression neutral, but inside, something small and important had shifted. The script he had been running in his head wasn't matching what was in front of him. Keanu looked at him, not with challenge, not with fear, just looked. And that look said something that no words could have communicated as clearly. I've already done the work. When someone looks at you like they've already prepared for every version of this moment, how does that make you feel? Comment safe or uneasy. Stephen spoke first, not aggressively, but firmly. He said what he needed to say, referenced experience, referenced history. Let the weight of his reputation settle into the room the way he always did. Keanu listened, completely, without interrupting, without preparing a response while Stephen was still talking. He just listened, and that was uncomfortable. Being ignored feels like an insult you can react to. Being truly heard and then met with silence feels like something else. It puts every word you just said back in front of you and forces you to hear it the way the other person heard it. Stephen's words landed differently in that silence than they had when he said them. Keanu paused for a moment. Then he spoke, quietly, clearly, without any aggression at all. He said he didn't need this to be what everyone was making it, that he wasn't here to take anything from anyone, that he respected what Stephen had built, but that he also knew who he was, and that knowing was enough. Not a threat, not a challenge. A statement of fact delivered with such complete calm that it had more weight than any raised voice could have carried. Stephen had prepared for a fight. What he got was a mirror. Do you think it's harder to fight someone who's angry at you or someone who's completely at peace with themselves? Comment angry or peaceful. Here's the part that most people who watched this story unfold couldn't fully articulate, but felt anyway. Keanu wasn't trying to win. He had walked in there with no desire to dominate, no need to humiliate, no plan to walk out with a story he could tell later. He had come to close something, to put something to rest. Not for the audience, not for the cameras, for himself. That kind of motivation is almost impossible to beat. When you're trying to win, you need the other person to lose. That gives them power over your outcome. But when you're trying to be at peace, nobody can take that from you. The outcome doesn't change what you walked in with. Stephen began to feel the ground shifting. Not dramatically, slowly. The way a tide moves, too gradual to panic about, but impossible to stop. He had options. He could press harder. He could raise the temperature. He could reassert dominance the way he always had. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the look in Keanu's eyes. The absence of desperation. The complete lack of anything to prove. Maybe it was the growing awareness that pressing harder wasn't going to give him what he was looking for. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the first quiet knock of self-awareness at a door Stephen hadn't opened in a long time. Have you ever been in an argument and suddenly realized mid-sentence that you were fighting for the wrong reason? Comment yes or no. Keanu took a small step back. Not retreating, just creating a little space, giving the moment room to breathe. He said something simple. He said he wasn't there to take anything from Steven, that Steven's legacy was his own, that he had nothing but respect for the path Steven had walked, but that he, Keanu, couldn't become something he wasn't just to satisfy what other people expected from this moment. There it was. The clearest sentence in the whole story: I can't become something I'm not just to satisfy what other people expect. That sentence hit differently than anything else, because it wasn't directed at Steven. It wasn't a challenge or a dig. It was just a truth Keanu was stating out loud. A line he was drawing, not against Steven, but for himself. And that kind of boundary is almost impossible to argue with. You can fight someone who's coming at you. You can't fight someone who is simply choosing to stay whole. Steven exhaled slowly. The tension in his shoulders, small but real, released slightly. He looked at Keanu for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that Keanu wasn't what he expected. Keanu almost smiled. He said most people weren't. And just like that, something enormous had been settled without anyone throwing a single thing. If someone wins without force and loses nothing in the process, is that the most complete kind of victory? Comment yes or no. In the hours and days that followed, the world reacted in a way nobody had fully predicted. People expected a story about who won. What they got was a story about what winning even means. Comments flooded in from everywhere. Not just fans of either man. Regular people. Young people. People who had never cared about either celebrity a single day before this. They were talking about something the story had accidentally touched. The idea that the most powerful thing a person can do in a moment of pressure is choose not to become something they aren't. That's not a fighting lesson. That's a life lesson. And it connected. Have you ever stayed calm in a situation where everyone expected you to explode and realized afterward how powerful that felt? Comment yes or no. Social media threads went deep. People started sharing their own versions of this story from their own lives. The boss who tried to humiliate them in front of others. The moment they chose to walk away from something they could have won, but didn't need to. The relationship where they stopped fighting not because they lost, but because they finally understood what they actually wanted. Keanu's calmness had become a conversation starter about something much larger than two celebrities. Steven's response afterwards was quieter than expected. No grand statement. No attempt to reframe the narrative in his favor. Just a kind of stillness that, for people who had followed him closely, felt new. Some people called it humility. Others called it wisdom arriving late. A few people said nothing had changed. But most people felt something different. They felt like Steven had learned something. Not a lesson about losing. A lesson about listening. Because that's what Keanu had actually done to him. Not defeated him. Not embarrassed him. He had made Steven hear himself. And once you truly hear yourself, some things become impossible to unhear. Do you think humility is something you're born with or something life forces you to learn? Comment born or learned. Here's the real reason this story spread the way it did. People are exhausted by noise. Not just in celebrity culture. In everything. In politics, in social media, in workplaces, in families. Everywhere you look, the loudest voice gets the most attention. The biggest reaction wins the algorithm. The most aggressive take gets the most shares. And somewhere deep down, in a place people don't always talk about, that exhausts everyone. So when a story shows up where the quiet one holds steady, where the calm doesn't crack, where the person with nothing to prove turns out to be the one with the most power, something in people responds. Not with logic, with feeling. A feeling that sounds like finally. Finally, someone showed that it works. Finally, someone proved that you don't have to be the loudest thing in the room to be the most powerful thing in the room. Keanu didn't try to teach anyone that lesson. He just lived it. And living a lesson is always louder than explaining one. What's one area of your life where you wish you could apply this kind of calm? Comment below. Seriously, think about it. Now here's something worth sitting with for a moment. Keanu Reeves has had a life full of reasons to become hard, full of reasons to build walls, to close off, to let bitterness do what bitterness does when it has enough material to work with. He didn't. He stayed soft in the ways that matter. Open, present, consistently kind to people who could do absolutely nothing for him. That softness isn't weakness. That softness is the hardest thing to hold on to when the world keeps handing you reasons to let it go. Steven Seagal built his identity around hardness, around the image of someone who couldn't be reached, couldn't be moved, couldn't be surprised. Keanu built his identity around something harder to describe, around showing up, around being real, around not needing the image to survive. When hardness meets presence, presence usually wins. Not because it's stronger, because it's realer. And real things last longer than built things. Which do you think holds up better over time, the image you build or the person you actually are? Comment image or person. The story didn't end when they walked away from that moment. Stories like this never really end. They travel. They get told in living rooms and in comment sections and in moments when someone else is standing at their own version of this crossroads, trying to decide whether to escalate or to stay whole. And they'll remember this. Not the details necessarily, not the names or the timeline, but the feeling of it. The reminder that control is a form of power most people underestimate. That patience isn't passivity. That choosing peace when you could choose war takes more strength than almost anything else. Steven walked away from this story different. Not broken, not defeated, different. Keanu walked away exactly the same. And that, more than anything else, is the whole story. The man who needed to win walked away having learned something. The man who needed nothing walked away having changed nothing about himself. If those are the two options, which one would you choose? Comment learn or stay. Because this was never really about Steven Seagal and Keanu Reeves. This was about two ways of moving through the world. One way built on being seen, on being feared, on making sure everyone in the room knows you cannot be challenged. The other way built on knowing yourself so completely that the room doesn't change what you carry. One of those ways is loud and powerful right up until the moment it isn't. The other one never stops working. If this story made you think about how you handle pressure, how you respond to conflict, or how you show up when something challenges who you are, then the most important question isn't about Keanu or Steven. It's about you. When pressure shows up in your life, what do you choose to become? Because that choice, more than talent, more than experience, more than any reputation you'll ever build, is what defines you. Drop your answer below. And if this story hit differently than you expected, you already know what to do.